So now for the practical stuff. And practical is in quotes. So my name is August, for those of you who didn't see my talk earlier today, and I live in Seattle and work as a designer for Microsoft. I've been asked by my colleagues to encourage everyone to tweet a nugget. Is this the first time you've seen this slide, or have you already seen it in some sessions? So yeah, a friend of mine actually helped design this keyboard and mouse set. It's fantastic, so I encourage you to participate. And since we're on the topic of social networking, again, here's my social networking names, I guess. All right, so in our last episode, which was this morning at the keynote, I talked about some really high-level stuff. And what I hope to show today is a level down towards more practical applications of that thinking. As the day has been unfolding, I've heard myself referred to as the key guy a few times. And for those of you who weren't at the talk this morning, I talked about being on the team that helped design the spec for the Windows key during the launch of Vista. And it took a little longer than I had expected. But another story about this is I travel a lot internationally for my work, and invariably there comes a customs official that reads the card and says, "Oh, you're a designer. What do you design?" And I peer over and look at the keyboard and I say, "See that key? Two over from the space bar? I designed that." And usually the interview ends right there and I get welcomed to the So, and as I mentioned, for 2.5 years, I led the user experience team for a product called Surface. And user experience in Microsoft parlance encompasses both research, user research, and design. And my team also had writers and editors as well. For those of you unfamiliar with Surface, it's a new interaction platform that involves multi-touch, multiple users, and object recognition. So when I first joined the team, a lot of the interpretations of what NUI would be seemed to be repurposed graphical user interface, or GUI applications, that thought of the hands as proxy for mice. And this doesn't come as much of a surprise. And I was reminded of a research group at Carnegie Mellon University, led by the late Randy Pausch, called the Stage 3 Research Group. And what this group suggests is that all media go through 3 particular stages. The first is the medium as a novelty, and the second stage is where this new medium starts borrowing from an existing predominant medium. And then the third stage is when that new medium starts developing its own techniques, its own idioms, and so forth. An example is film and theater. The technology of filmmaking was originally as a documentation device. One of the big questions that it helped answer was, do all 4 hooves of the horse leave the ground when it gallops? And then someone had the idea of telling stories with a film camera. And the first films borrowed from theater. In fact, it seemed as though the camera was just another audience member. It was just placed in the audience, and a play was performed in front of the camera. And later, it started to, film as a medium started developing its own idioms, like the crossfade, the flashback, and different camera angles, and so forth. And we see the same sort of phenomenon with web and print, where first there was the new medium, and then the web started borrowing its practices from print. I mean, the fact that we call them web pages points that out. But now we know that web has its own particular techniques and idioms that are native to it as a medium. And some of my latest work suggests there's a fourth phase where the new medium starts informing and influencing the old medium. But that's another talk. So When I'm talking about the differences between graphical user interface and natural user interface, one thing that I'd mentioned was it's the differences that are the same. And so my team and I had looked at the differences between command line user interface and graphical user interface and used that to inform how we started guiding the development of NUI for the Surface. In fact, a lot of what we had discovered seemed almost counterintuitive to what we had presumed. And keep in mind, we've been thinking about our medium for the past 30 years in terms of the mouse, the pointer, menus, and so forth. And it got to the point where it was so counterintuitive, a lot of our conclusions, that we thought, well, basically, let's just do the opposite of everything we think about. In fact, there's one piece from the history of art, philosophy, and literature that kind of captures the sentiment, and that is from the Annals of Seinfeld. I'll play this.
Why did it all turn out like this for me? I had so much promise. I was personable. I was bright. Oh, maybe not academically speaking, but I was perceptive. I always know when someone's uncomfortable at a party. Got knocking over there? It all became very clear to me sitting out there today that every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be. Every instinct I have in every aspect of life, be it something to wear, something to eat, it's all been wrong. Everyone.
Tuna on toast, coleslaw, cup of coffee.
Yeah. No, wait a minute. I always have tuna on toast. Nothing's ever worked out for me with tuna on toast. I want the complete opposite of tuna on toast. Chicken salad on rye, untoasted, with a side of potato salad, and a cup of tea.
Well, there's no telling what can happen from this.
You know, chicken salad's not the opposite of tuna. Salmon's the opposite of tuna, because salmon swim against the current, and the tuna swim with it.
Good for the tuna.
George, you know, that woman just looked at you.
So what? What am I supposed to do?
Go talk to her.
Elaine, bald men with no jobs and no money who live with their parents.
Well, here's your chance to try the opposite. Instead of tuna salad and being intimidated by women, chicken salad and going right up.
Yeah, I should do the opposite.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
Yes. I will do the opposite. I used to sit here and do nothing and regret it for the rest of the day. So now I will do the opposite and I will do something. Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice that you were looking in my direction.
Oh, yes, I was. You just ordered the same exact lunch as me.
My name is George. I'm unemployed and I live with my parents.
I'm Victoria. Hi.
So it's kind of like that. As I mentioned this morning, I thought I'd go into further detail about the differences that we'd identified between command line and GUI and the GUI and NUI. And in fact, towards the end of this talk, I'll go into a bit more detail about what comes next. And if we invoke this principle that it's the differences that are the same, then we can find certain patterns that evolve. In fact, one thing I'd like to point out is that our head of user research on our team was around during the advent of the mouse, during the advent of graphical user interface. And he confirmed that, in fact, the differences, the problems that users encountered moving into NUI from graphical user interface are identical to the ones moving from command line to GUI. It's just the execution is a bit different. So the five categories of differences begin with the perception of the user behavior. And this one talks about the perception that command line interfaces are static and GUIs are responsive. And following this train of thought, NUIs are then evocative. In other words, they're responsive like GUIs, but they kind of indicate what a user should do next. Here's the concept of feed forward as opposed to feedback. Next is about the relationship of the cognitive model of the user to his or her physical behavior. So in command line, it's completely disconnected as far as typing and the perception of typing. And in GUI, it's indirect. Indirect in the sense that if I'm moving my hand back and forth, the cursor is moving back and forth like this. And in NUI, it's immediate. It's unmediated or direct. The third of the five patterns is the relationship of the number of possible paths a user can take at any given moment during the experience relative to the frequency in which the user interacts with a system. So in command line, the number of possible paths is relatively high, but the rate of interaction with the system is relatively low. This kind of evens out in GUI, and it tips in NUI, where there are fewer choices, but the rate of interaction is much quicker. And I'll get into one of the details around this in a bit. The fourth is about the user's role in directing the experience. And in command line, it seems the thrust of the direction of the experience comes from the user. While in GUI, this shifts to being more exploratory. And exploratory in the sense that if I click the file menu, I'm looking at the choices that follow underneath, and I can go to a submenu and a submenu after that. And in that sense, it's exploratory. And while in NUI, it shifts to becoming contextual. In other words, I'm given just enough clues to draw a conclusion about what I can do next. And finally, this pattern is about user behavior, where in command line, it's about recall. You have to recall which commands to invoke at what point. And in GUI, it becomes more of a recognition. In other words, the standard file menu is a very familiar structure, even though the items in the file menu will change. So in this way, one can kind of navigate a whole new application, even though it's completely alien. And finally, NUI, it shifts a bit as well, where the user conclusion of this is that it's intuitive or natural, hence the term. So these are the five areas of natural user interface in which we identified the difference and came up with some guiding principles and invoked some laws from other disciplines. And I'll talk about that in further detail, but to kind of break the rhythm of it, because it's going to get pretty academic in a moment. My team and I developed a kind of trilogy of conceptual videos around what this and the next inflection points could be. And each of them had a theme, home, work, and play. And I'm going to show these in reverse order, and just to be, since it's just between us. The play one is really bizarre. This was directed by my former design director, Kai Hofmeister. He's a crazy Dutch guy. You'll see what I mean when we play this. Okay, so I warned you. What's interesting about this, though, is when I sit down with Kai and he explains all the metaphor and all the symbolism, I feel like I'm reading a Dan Brown novel, but apparently it's all in there. So. Okay, so let's get to this top 10 stuff. So the first tip is use the free stuff. So this morning I talked about how we have these kind of built-in algorithms, like this is one where we recognize ourselves in these images. Another one that's a freebie is Newton's third law, whether we believe it or not. And basically, to every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If you like formulas, here it is. And the implication for NUI is that every user act must yield a reaction by the system, even if that action is accidental, off-target, or inaccurate. Here's some of the shorthand. And by the way, these decks will be distributed, so you don't need to feverishly take notes. I think you'll get all of these when the slides are up for download. What's important here is that there's no arbitrary touch. In fact, we developed a feature that we called No Touch Left Behind, and it was developed by our user experience architect on our team that was kind of inspired by a cross-country flight that he had taken where there were the screens on the back of the seats, and apparently he was seated in front of some kid that kept jamming his screen over and over again, so he felt his seat move throughout the whole flight. And unbeknownst to the kid, he was sitting behind one of the world's foremost experts on touch. And so Daniel, that was the guy's name, had this idea that every screen, like every touch, should acknowledge a user's touch. Every screen should acknowledge a user's touch. And if you get a chance to play with the Surface unit, you'll see that whether a touch is conclusive to an action or not, that every touch is recognized. And in terms of NUI, going beyond touch, there are other sensorial forms that can be registered. The last one, the proprioceptional one, we have these debates about what the senses are and how there are way more senses than just the 5 senses. Apparently there's 17 senses. So if you're tweeting a nugget, that's a good nugget. A proprioceptional sense is your sense of motion. So if you're sitting in a room and you feel like you're moving, apparently it falls into that category. All right, so number 2. I talked a bit about this. I touched on it for 5 seconds this morning, which is about prioritizing learnability over discoverability. In section 1, I talked about how natural user interface leverages a lot of these built-in algorithms that we think of as intuitive. Number 2 is about learnability, and I mentioned that an area of software development that does this really well is video games. And for those of you unfamiliar with World of Warcraft, there are 2 parts of the game, one where you level to get to the highest level, and then the second part of the game is what's known as the Elder Game, which changes the dynamics of the game. But basically, what happens during that leveling phase is actually the system teaching the user all of these skills, and there are dozens and dozens of skills in order to master the Elder Game. So you can see how the UI develops with add-ons from the user, from the image on the left, which is something that a player gets innate, where there's all sorts of augments to the UI. Now, I'm going to go about this in a little bit of detail, and I took this part of the talk from a colleague of mine named Daniel Cook, who is a program manager in the games group. But he goes into further detail about learning and how the secret behind how games do this successfully. And you can find this in his blog called lostgarden.com. But basically what I'm going to do in this section is share something that he's called building the princess saving app, or what would happen if we took a well-known video game like the Mario Brothers game and turned it into an application and vice versa. So he posed this question, and this was his first response, the Rescuing the Princess Enterprise 2008 edition. It would look something like this, where you choose your player, and there's the rescuee, and you keep jamming the button to execute jumping. And the thing about this kind of traditional application is that it has a pretty steep learning curve. While the capabilities and the number of functions is really high, there comes a point where it becomes increasingly difficult to learn all those functions. So along comes Rescue Princess 2.0, which is basically breaks down the functions of that app, and you just hit the button and the princess is rescued. And what's interesting about this is, in relative comparison, the number of capabilities that the application has to offer is relatively low, but the learning curve is shallow. So this kind of presents a usability dilemma, where you could either go simple and easy with limited capabilities, or you could go complex with a lot of capabilities, but it's painful to learn. Well, the thing, and this is the thing about video games, is it kind of beats this conundrum. And this is a reference to Shigeru Miyamoto, who's one of the forefathers of video games, from which Daniel Cook got this. So if we look at Rescue the Princess, the game, which is a reference to Super Mario Brothers, you kind of deconstruct what a user has to the skills that a user has to successfully execute in order to accomplish the entire parameters of the game. And these are dozens and dozens of skills that a user has to learn. And what's interesting about games in particular, and when I talk about World of Warcraft, which is unusual, again, these are literally dozens of skills that have no practical value in the real world. And this is, yes, gold mining aside, but have no practical value or economic value in the real world. The people are paying a monthly fee, and I'm talking like 9 million people are paying a monthly fee to master dozens and dozens of these skills willingly. Now imagine if we could harness that for applications like Excel and Word and so forth. And so the way games do it, and this goes back to the whole learning curve, is there's this kind of cycle where the more skills a user learns, they build off of each other. The educational term is scaffolding. They scaffold off of each other, and users experience fun and delight. And so the secret ingredient to the fun is what Cook calls exploratory learning. And basically, he's devised something that he calls the STARS atom. And that is a unit of learning that games use. And here's the outline of it. But basically, a user is presented with a goal. And like in this case, Metroid, at this point in the game, the user has to learn a skill to ascend this well. And is provided a stimulus to indicate what that goal is. Then the user starts figuring out what skills are needed to be are used to accomplish that goal. And they're given some tools and actions, and then they kind of process what happens by trying out these new skills. And they're given a stimulus of whether it succeeded or failed. And if it succeeds, well then that updates their mental model, and the skill is acquired. And if you just repeat that a few times, you accomplish the goal. And so what happens is, as these goals get scaffolded, the skills build off each other until finally the user has acquired dozens and dozens of skills to accomplish this. And they've done it in a way that is not only voluntary, but really enjoyable. And keep in mind, one of the first primers of these video games is no one reads the manual. Everyone, you just start playing, and that's just the reality of the situation. And so what we've tried to do in Surface is start using some of these structures in ways that we could teach users how to learn really complex gestures. I could talk about that after this talk during the Q&A. But yes, that's how we tied it back to Surface. All right, so number 3. The Piaget's INRC set refers to this guy. His name is Jean Piaget. He's a well-renowned child psychologist, although he didn't identify himself as a child psychologist. One of the professors on my thesis committee was a student of his, so I got a lot of his thinking in spades. And what Piaget introduced was something called an INRC set. And this should sound really familiar, especially as far as mathematical properties. But the 4 components of the INRC group, or the INRC set, are identity, negation, reciprocation, and correlation. And the experiment, one of the experiments that he had conducted with children was to figure out how children learn a system. And in this particular experiment around the INRC group, there is a plank with a slot drilled in, and then there is a toy snail that was put on a pencil mount that could slide back and forth, so it looked like the snail was moving back and forth on the plank. So the child was asked how he or she would imagine the snail would move, and here's where the I in the INRC set comes in. The child identifies that a snail could move to one side or the other. And then the N is the negation, or the opposite action. And then this should apply to the board as well. So if the board moves, it not only reciprocates, but correlates the action of the snail. Really seemingly simple stuff. But when you start applying it to natural user interface, you realize that a lot of systems do not adhere to this. And so they kind of violate our intuitive learning cycles. And one thing that we noted is that the mouse click, does not adhere to the INRC. In fact, this contributes to a lot of hesitancy and anxiety and frustration that novice users encounter when they interact with the mouse. Because the mouse click is kind of like a point of no return. It's an all or nothing proposition where once you click it, there's no coming back. And yes, there's undo and Control Z and so forth, but that doesn't adhere to INRC because the undo or the Control Z is not the opposite reaction of the snail moving to the right. It's not moving to the left. And so when we start thinking about natural user interface, we brainstorm a lot of ideas and use this as a way of thinking, well, is this intuitive or not? And one idea that comes up a lot, especially in the development of Surface apps, is sliding something off the table to delete it, which seems like a fairly intuitive thing. But the problem is you can't slide it back. It doesn't adhere to INRC. So some of the things that some of the actions that we do might not seem like the most obvious ones, like pushing something off the table, but we do that to adhere to Piaget's group. All right, number 4, law of effect. So, and this is Thorndike's law of effect, the one we're going to be using here. But basically, it's that actions that lead to a positive outcome will likely be repeated. And I'm going to refer to the Skinner box and in experimental psychology, where the rats are awarded with some food if they repeat a certain action. And the user researcher that I was talking with said, yes, include the formula. There will be people in the audience that love the formula. I can't begin to explain this formula, but full disclosure, there it is. But basically, the new implication is that successful actions will be repeated and likely to be tried in similar situations. So where this comes out is kind of like the converse, and the users will also try to stop doing what they deem as failed. And so one of the hot points that we discuss is that we're trying to eliminate users' reliance on tapping the tabletop, because again, that's kind of a mimicry of the mouse click, and it's not reversible. We're proponents of the drag as the primitive, the interaction primitive for multi-touch interfaces. And what we found in our user research is the users quickly overcome their urge to tap and then double tap, and then they start dragging. And once they realize the drag is the successful interaction, they forget about tapping and double tapping altogether. And here are some of the implications. And the last point, which is interesting, is a lot of these false interactions, like when a bracelet or a shirt sleeve hits the table, that creates really crazy superstitious behavior as well. And we've seen people doing all sorts of finger yoga on the table, trying to repeat what they've done. Number 5 is the Hick-Hyman law. And this is kind of the Newey version of what Fitz's law was to GUI. And for those of you unfamiliar with Fitz's law, it has to do with the time that a target can be reached according to its size and its distance from origination. The Newey equivalent would be the Hick-Hyman law, which is basically the more choices you have, the longer it takes to make a decision. And again, for those of you in the audience who are interested, here's the formula. But the implication is basically this, that you reduce the number of similar choices to reduce complexity and time for decision making. And this goes back to that difference that we found about number of possible choices at any given moment and increasing the frequency that a user interacts with the system. So you're probably thinking, yes, I get it. Make everything simple. Let's move on. No, we can't move on. I have to give a little visual representation of what this means. Basically, if you have a lot of choices going through a large bandwidth of capacity of choices, then you get a similar output. But doing that same thing with a smaller capacity is smaller. So again, for the visual thinkers in the room, you reduce the number of choices, and you'll have a smaller capacity and a shorter time for decision making. So again, here are the implications around decision making, and what it doesn't suggest is to dumb down all decision making. And again, that's kind of it's hard to explain without having a Surface app right here. But in lieu of that, let's play a quick game. So imagine that you are at the Evergreen Hospital in Kirkland, Washington, which is a suburb of Seattle. And then you just walk in an elevator, and you spot someone outside running towards it as well, and the doors are closing. And you reach for the panel. Now, which button do you hit? And here's the panel. All right. So Yeah, this panel was presented to me by our user researcher, Steve Siow. And it's like, yeah, there should just be an open button, a closed button. And I don't know what's with the starfish and the seahorse. And I was thinking, yeah, this kind of thing only happens to Steve. He'd find like the one crazy elevator in all of Seattle. And then not a week later, I was in Pal's Books in Portland, Oregon, with some colleagues, and the exact same thing happened to me. So I had to like take a picture of this panel as well, where my colleague was running towards the elevator, and someone later said, "Why don't you just put your hand in front?" Yeah, well, but then I wouldn't have anything to talk about now. All right, so here's the second. here's the second clip in our trilogy. This was done a year earlier, and the theme for this is work. So I think that was a little more accessible than the last one. All right, so we're a little bit over our halfway mark. These last 5 won't take as long as the first 5. So this next one is about the term natural, which is also another big hot button that we talk about, because a lot of people take natural almost too literally. And really what we're talking about is the idea of naturally as a conclusion that a user might have once he or she experiences this. And on this segment, I want to talk about a user research methodology on how we tried to derive things that were natural. And in the sense that user researches could be broken down into these 3 areas, this is more of a generative exercise rather than evaluative, like usability might be considered. So what happens in this is we show participants pieces of paper the size of a screen actually on the device. And the 2 pieces of paper are like a before and an after. And then we ask them, what gestures or finger motions would you use to get from the first screen to the second one? And so let's kind of do that together as a group. So the box on the left would be something that we show before, and then we'd overlay or show side by side another screen, which would be the box on the right. So a lot of us, if this were the actual study, a lot of us would drag the thing with a pointer. So I hope everyone's got that. Let's run through these. All right, so you can just kind of do it in your head. So here's one. And we can thank our friends in Cupertino for popularizing this one. Here's another. Again, it's a pretty straightforward thing. Let's try this one. Okay. Now let's try this one. It's a little more complex. So, like, yeah, again, if you were posed with a question, what's the natural way of going from screen A to screen B? That's when really interesting gestures and finger manipulations start coming out. And then here's one. I'm just kidding. Okay, so number 7 is what I call see-through fingers, and it doesn't mean transparent or invisible fingers, but basically it's the idea that what you see and what you think you see are 2 different things. And it's the people, users, when they interact with the surface, they're not thinking about their fingertips as the point of interaction, but they think of the point of interaction as the space right directly below their fingernail. So one of the takeaways from this is not to obfuscate the UI or let the UI move around the finger or frame the finger as the user is interacting with it. And again, in the same sense, it's the differences that are the same. Our user researcher said in the early days of GUI, there was a similar thing about where the hot spot on the mouse cursor was. And one of the original inclinations was it was the pixel at the very point of the arrow, when in fact the hot spot of the cursor is actually somewhere beneath the arrowhead. And to help us kind of explore this or think about what we could do, I'm going to show two forms of paper prototyping that one of our designers, Paul Hoover, developed this method where we like sketching and we like doing really rough and quick sketches. In fact, Bill Buxton says the fidelity of one's presentation should match the fidelity of thinking. And so in this sense, cameras are really cheap and easy to come by, and we use the Windows video tools to edit these. Here's an example of how we explore these things. And there's no sound, but it should be pretty self-explanatory. And the examples that I'm showing are concepts that we threw out very early. I'm not showing anything proprietary, so bloggers can calm down. But here's an example of one, and let me jump to another one. This was when we were looking at the book as a metaphor for interaction. And in this case, how do we apply different actions to it? And again, this is early stage thinking. This isn't what's actually in development. But I'm just showing this as a way of how we do quick sketches where motion and finger placement and hand placement and driving gestures can be mocked up really quickly. And it's hard to communicate these temporal qualities in storyboards, and this is kind of a quick workaround for that. Okay, so number 8 is the law of threshold detection. But basically, UI elements must have a property at or above normal or comfortable detection. And the point around this is that no UI element, particularly in multi-touch systems, tends to be by itself. All right, so in the US we call this Where's Waldo? Here it's Wallace. Oh, sorry? Wally? Okay, Wally. All right, so yeah, so here it is as an example of signal detection theory. But basically, once something has met the absolute threshold, then there's kind of a diminishing return once you notice something. So I don't know if you can see the square here at 25%, but the moment it hits the threshold of salience, once we go back to it, you could still see the square. What's interesting is once that phenomenon is surrounded by things that look like what you want, the salience or the signal detection gets decreased. And here's the example, and here's the solution. There it is. Okay, and so and here's a shot of one of the archetypal surface apps, which is scattered photos. So that's where things like this come into play. So one of the conclusions that we derive from this is to apply just enough salience to the UI. Number 9 is it's along the same lines, where a lot of the observations that we got from third-party observations, as us as a third party watching users, is that a lot of the screens looked really cluttered. But basically, the gist of this is it's the user that has created the clutter, or the users have created the clutter, then it's fine. And the example from the real world is this is a colleague's home office, which apparently he knows exactly where everything is. And then he later showed me what his wife did after he cleaned up, and completely freaked out. But what's interesting about this is from our standpoint, it seems the image on the right is the much more organized one. But from his point of view, he knows where nothing is, while the image on the left, which seems cluttered, is actually the more organized from his framework. All right, number 10. Not all touches are equal. The gist of this, of number 10, is that different touch technologies allow for different touches and gestures. And so the Surface unit actually allows for full multi-touch, but the thing is there are a lot of interactions that treat a multi-touch or a full-touch system as though it were just a plain old touch screen. And in this case, one is not realizing the full benefit of the system. And here are some examples of different levels of touch that can be produced or interpreted by Surface. And in fact, the Surface unit has two different types of cameras, an infrared and a traditional camera. So there's all sorts of information that for now is generally not leveraged, but it's a really powerful touch technology. So the gist of number 10 is use the touches that are appropriate for the technology. All right, so here's the rundown of the top 10. Use what you get for free, learnability over discoverability. Remember Piaget's INRC group. There's the law of effect. There's the Hick-Hyman law, reduce the number of choices. There's the whole idea of naturally. That was the ad hoc generative user research technique. It's about thinking about where the fingers touch and how what we think we see is not what is actually happening. There's the notion of salience. The clutter is all right as long as it's user-generated. And finally, some touches are more equal than others. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned our thoughts around this fourth column. And here we see a system that has a fluid system behavior. And the relationship between the user's physical reaction and the system behavior becomes extensive, where it almost seems as though the user is not making choices, but in fact the system is responding to users' actions implicitly. So the conclusion is the system seems to be both anticipatory and a kind of synthetic system, or synthetic. There's the law of effect. There's the Hick-Hyman law, reduce the number of choices. There's the whole idea of naturally. That was the ad hoc generative user research technique. It's about thinking about where the fingers touch and how what we think we see is not what is actually happening. There's the notion of salience. The clutter is all right as long as it's user-generated. And finally, some touches are more equal than others. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned our thoughts around this fourth column. And here we see a system that has a fluid system behavior. And the relationship between the user's physical reaction and the system behavior becomes extensive, where it almost seems as though the user is not making choices, but in fact the system is responding to users' actions implicitly. So the conclusion is the system seems to be both anticipatory and a kind of synthetic system, or a synthetic relationship between the user and the system. So to help illustrate this, here's the first of those three conceptual videos. And this is from Ancient History back in 2007. and the theme for this was home. And that's just an acronym for, I can't repeat what it stands for. All right, so that's all I had to say. Thank you very much for listening. So I had an 11th one, which was give more than expected. So thanks again for listening. I'd like to recommend Shane Morris's session. There's one later today on multi-touch, multi-user, and multi-challenge. And there's one, it's a dev-focused one called Pimp My App, because as a wise man once said, pimping ain't easy. So that's all. Thank you.